Okay, good morning, Clever. Great to see everybody this morning. As we discussed, today's title was What Jews Do When Living in an Unjust World. And I'll tell you where and why I've chosen that. I've gone for a bunch of coffees with different people, really just talk about specific things, nothing to do with anything going on in the world. And just about well, I love kosher, but one of the problems with kosher, aside from the fact that it's a little bit expensive, is that you're limited to the places you can go to eat. So you're always surrounded by your fellow Jews. And when your fellow Jews see you, then what they do is they say, this is horrible. Did you read the news? And every single problem about how the world, all the difficulties that are there. And I experience viscerally their angst and anxiety and anger and depression and hopelessness and all of those things that they seem to carry around with them. And I feel obviously what's happening around us is not something that a person feels like this is great. But the question is, what do you do when living in such a world? What's our response? And how do we make sure not to go to that space where that's all that we carry? What are we supposed to do? So I'd like to share with you a short thing that happened at my door a couple of days ago, and a beautiful midrash, and then a really beautiful piece by Rav Cook, which I actually shared on my podcast, but it's so beautiful. I want to share it here as well because I think it really relates to our theme. So in our neighborhood, there are people that come around. They are collecting for various things, whether it be personal, organizational. They'll knock on your door. They're colloquially called mishulachim, from the idea of being sholeach, being sent. So they're here. Somebody was collecting for a special needs school. Someone was collecting for a school. Someone was collecting for personal needs, whatever it might be. So I usually try, as we always should, to greet people with a smile. We should always be everyone should be on the right side of the door, not on the other side of the door. But the least we can always do is give a person a smile, because chances are, if they're knocking on the door for a reason, they already are not feeling so great. And I was kibitzing with one of them. And then afterwards, I asked him the question of, who can I make the check out to? And he said, I say in Hebrew, he was saying, I'll just translate in English. He says, I say this respectfully, sir. He says, but it's funny. I always get asked the question, who should I make it out to? I don't get the question saying, how much do you want me to make it out for? So we kibitzed and laughed. And then I said, you're right. And I'm not going to ask you that question also right now. But it stuck with me. And it reminded me actually of a beautiful little Maisa with a chassid that somebody once went to his Rebbe. And he said, Rebbe, here, I've got a whole list of things that I need. And the Rebbe looks at his list and he says, I see that you've put tremendous thought in the things in life that you need. Have you given equal thought towards where in life you are needed? And this balance between what it is that we want or what it is that we see versus what is our role within that, I think is a very important, and in fact, it's a fundamental Jewish response. And it dates all the way back to Avram. There's a famous midrash in Midrash Rabbah, part of our oral teachings written thousands of years ago, which talks about that when Avram is lech lecha, he's going on his way. As he's walking, he sees a house that's burning. And the medrash goes that he's looking around. He's like, doesn't anyone own this house? What's going on? And God says, yeah, I'm owning the house. It's my house. But what are you going to do about it? Meaning, yes, like there is something going on here. Yes, it happens to be mine. But what are you going to do with the fire that you see burning? And I think it's in that tension where we see certain things, and as opposed to just taking it in and holding it, it's a question of what do we do with that? I recently saw a very powerful Zoom that the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs put out there. And he was asked a question in it. And actually, I believe that the person interviewing him at the time wasn't aware of his sickness. He kept it very quiet until close to the end. It was one of his last interviews or Zooms, just educating. And they had said that many years ago, when he was asked the question of why do bad things happen to good people, he had said, listen, we don't have the answer. We'll never have the answer. And this lady asked him, I was wondering a couple of years later, do you have any more insight into this? And it's uniquely profound because, as I mentioned, I think it was at a time where he was going through something that she didn't know, which ultimately took his life. And he was very emotional, obviously, although I don't know if she understood why all that emotion was there potentially. And he said, yes, I think I have a new insight into why that's the case. And he says, we don't know the answers of why things that happen around us happen. We can't have the explanation. He says, and I believe that God doesn't want us to know the reason for why it happens, because he wants us not to accept it. Because if we accepted it, we would do nothing about it. But as long as we sit there and say this isn't right, then we sit there and we respond to that challenge and that reality. And I think that while it applied to a very specific situation of a personal or what we consider bad things to good people, which we usually see as ourselves, the reality is that answer is really the same idea of that burning bush, of the burning house that Avram saw. Yes, it's burning. I understand that. Why? God doesn't say, well, it's happening because of this. He says, I know something's burning. The question that I have for you, as opposed to you asking me why or who's responsible for this, my question that God says to you is, what are you going to do about it? And in that space might actually be the reason, the mission, the purpose of why each and every one of us are here in our own little area. Now, we know the famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. It was turned into a song, which some of you might be familiar with, of Lo Alecha Hamlacha Ligmor V'lo Ata Ben Chorin Li Batal Mimena, right? Which translates as, Lo Alecha Hamlacha. We don't have to finish the work, but we can't stop doing it. We have the obligation to continue trying. Meaning, I don't think, with all due respect to the wonderful people on there, myself included, I don't think any single one of us are going to be the one to solve the world's problems of everything, but that doesn't stop us from solving the area in the specific situation that we can, and we don't know how that will go ahead and feed into the larger picture of what happens. I don't know if you saw, I just saw this morning on my family WhatsApp chat that there was this flyer that went out about a kid that was getting bullied in his school somewhere in the Wilson and Bathurst area, and they put out a flyer saying, please help us walk this kid to school safely. And I just got a video of that literally 5 minutes ago of, I think, the MPP and the MP and the whoever else in the political there, and probably about over 100 or 150 people of that community that were all gathered around walking. The parents asked for this help, walking the kids together. They all saw this call, got out there, and they said, listen, this is what we have to do. When we see one act of something happening, how do we sit there and not sit there and go to the coffee shop and say, it's horrible, did you hear what happened in the school? What do we do with that? And I think that that's something that we, especially as this goes on longer, we lose that perspective because we become more, whether it be, overwhelmed with sadness of how much it's happening, but it doesn't mean that we stop. It means the opposite. We need to, as much as we can, do what we can. And there was a beautiful quote. I'm not sure if people went. There was a wonderful celebration for Yom HaTzmaut and part of the commemoration of Yom HaZikaron up at the Schwartz Reisman with Mizrahi and the UJ together at the JCC. And Rabbi Ilan Mazer, who's the head of Mizrahi, brought a quote from Rabbi Yitzchak, from Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook, from the first Ashkenaz chief rabbi of Israel. And it was such a beautiful, powerful quote that when we think about these terms of what do we do when we live in an unjust world, again, so often our response is we read the paper, we fetch to our echo chamber, and we get despondent and a little bit, hopeless about what the situation will be. But we know, obviously, we've spoken about this before in different contexts. We know that we get through this like everything else. But the question is, what do we do now? And I'd like to share with you the words that Rav Kook said. I'll read it in Hebrew and translate that. These words are always so beautiful, both in Hebrew as well as in English. He said, "Hatzadikim hatoarim," the truly righteous people. What do? Eno kublim al harisha'a ela mosifin tzedek. He says they don't complain about evil. They just increase justice. Enam koblim ala kfira, ela mosifin chachma. They don't complain about heresy and these religious fanatics that gone crazy. Rather, they just increase in their faith. And eno kublim al ha ba'orim ela mosifim chachma. They don't go ahead and complain about all the ignorance that they see around with people and in the world. Rather, they increase wisdom. Meaning in each one of these situations where they see something, they either focus on that which is not going well, and they say, oh, look at this, or they say, wait, if there's a tremendous amount of lack of something, then my goal is how to feel that. There's a beautiful quote by the Lubavitcher Rebbe I remember seeing. I Googled right before we got on, and luckily I found it. Lubavitcher Rebbe says as follows: if you see what needs to be repaired, and you know how to repair it, then you have found a piece of the world that God has left for you to complete. Meaning that same idea in the beginning, when you see something that's wrong, that's burning, and Hashem saying, I'm showing this to you, you specifically, at this point, at this juncture, in the position that you're in, whatever way. Why? Because I left something for you to do in this world. And he says, furthermore, but if you only see what's wrong and what's ugly in the world, well, then perhaps it's you yourself that needs repair. Meaning if all you do is in that space of you see the things, and maybe here it's referring specifically to you're the complainer about issues, then maybe, stop complaining so much. But also I think it could apply to the fact that there's something wrong with the individual in terms of if all you see is what's wrong and you complain and you can't do something, then there's fixing there. What's the fixing? The fixing is, wait, you've got the wrong mentality. What is it that we can and should be doing? And we're not judged ever by the success of the impact of what we do, right? We get in this, they do it in school sometimes, but they don't really emphasize it enough. The A for effort is what matters. I remember hearing a story once of a great Rebbe of Edelstein, that there was a student who had left the Jewish faith. He was just off, and his father had obviously, it bothered him. He wanted to carry on the continuity, and he called him to go see that, to come with this rabbi that was speaking. And out of respect for his father, he went. And he listened to this rabbi speak, and then afterwards he told his father, and it was part of his journey back. He said, I remember when this rabbi came to my little cheder when I was a kid. He says, and what happened when I was there is he was asking all the kids, questions, easy questions for them to answer. This person answered that question. That person answered the other question. He asked me the question. He says, and I didn't know the answer. I was a little bit embarrassed. So then he asked me another question. I didn't get the answer to that one. He asked me a third one. I didn't get the one to that as well. And then after class, when everybody was walking out, each person who answered a question, he gave a candy to. And I was in there and I was so petrified. I was going to walk past this rabbi and I wouldn't get my candy because I didn't answer the question. And as I walked up in line to him and he looked at me, he went into his bag of candies and he pulled out not one candy, but 3 candies. I said, what's this for? He said, listen, everybody else, they tried once. Said, you tried 3 times, so you get 3 candies for that. Right? Our efforts that we put in, sometimes we feel like it doesn't make a difference. We don't know the reason why things happen like we started, right? But we know that those things, we don't know why, so that we react to them. Will we finish the problem? I doubt any one of us individually will. Collectively, hopefully we will. But one thing we know for sure, that if we're seeing something that's out there, the fixing that we need is not how do we sit there and go ahead and complain more about that, but rather what do we do and how can we act in whatever way possible. And I think that message, again, as we go into this period of, longevity, where we don't know what's going to happen and it's not fresh anymore, we get to the space of, losing a little bit of the pride. And you see sometimes people stopping focusing on how resilient and amazing we are. We have to remind ourselves that when we're out there and we see things that are taking place, our goal is, when we live in an unjust world, is how do we go ahead and invest in whatever way we can more justice. When we see more ignorance, how do we invest more wisdom? And when we see less ability to be able to live a high, moral, beautiful life, how do we sit there and fill that space a little bit more as well? We do our efforts down here, then ultimately up there, hopefully he kicks in and we get out of this as well as soon as we can. So Chevra, on this long weekend, I want to wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos, and may we all do our part to be part of the solution. It's easy to be able to identify the problems. The real doctor is the one that can sit there, get in there, and fix up the issues as well. So each and every one of us have a role to play in that, and let's do our job. Chevra, have a great Shabbos. I'm going to stop the recording, and obviously.
Amen. Good Shabbos.
Shabbat
Thank you,
shalom,
Rabbi. Shabbat
you,
shalom
Rabbi.
u'mevorach.